There is a borough in Columbia County, Pennsylvania, that does not exist anymore. Not in the way that towns sometimes fade, not slowly, not from poverty alone, not from the long attrition of young people leaving for cities, or factories closing, or a railroad pulling up its tracks and moving on. Those are ordinary endings, and there is nothing ordinary about what happened to Centralia. Centralia was condemned by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, by eminent domain, by an act of government that declared the land itself, not a building, not a block, but the earth, unfit for human occupation. Every deed, every mortgage, every title that said, "This is mine, this is where I live, this is where I will grow old," all of it voided, all of it taken. The ground beneath the town's feet had become the enemy, and no one, not the state, not the federal government, not the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, could do a single thing to stop it. But on the morning of May 27th, 1962, none of that had happened yet. On the morning of May 27th, 1962, Centralia was still a town. Picture yourself standing here. Not in the Centralia that exists today, that void of empty streets and steam vents and government warning signs, but in the Centralia of that Sunday morning. A cool Pennsylvania spring dawn, the kind that smells of cut grass and wood smoke and the particular mineral freshness of mountain air. Church bells from St. Ignatius on the hill, ringing the 7 o'clock hour over rooftops that were at that moment still intact, still inhabited, still warm with the ordinary heat of people sleeping, of percolating coffee, of a gas burner left low on the stove. Locust Avenue ran the length of the town the way a spine runs the length of a body. Along it, in 1962, stood the things that make a place real. A barber shop with a striped pole still turning. A 5 and dime with its weekend window display. The post office, which had been operating continuously since 1865, sorted and delivered mail for a community of over 1,000 souls. Miners' families, Ukrainian and Irish immigrants, the grandchildren of men who had come to this particular fold of the Appalachian Mountains because the mountains held coal, and coal, in those days, held a future. At its absolute peak, the census of 1890, Centralia had been home to 2,761 people. It had 7 churches, 5 hotels, 27 saloons, 2 theaters, a bank, a post office, and 14 general and grocery stores. 27 saloons. Let that number settle for a moment. This was not a sleepy village. This was a place, loud and alive, and sometimes violent, with the particular energy of a community that had been built by people who worked with their bodies, and drank hard, and prayed hard, and buried their dead in hillside cemeteries that overlooked the valley they had claimed as their own. By 1962, the population had thinned considerably from that Victorian high water mark. The coal companies had been pulling back for decades. The market for anthracite had peaked around the First World War and declined steadily since. But Centralia was still a pleasant community of about 1,435 people. A town with a functioning council, a volunteer fire company, parochial schools, churches still holding services in Ukrainian and English and Russian. A community that had absorbed hard times before and had always found a way to remain. It was preparing for Memorial Day. That is the detail that lodges in the throat when you sit with it long enough. Memorial Day, the holiday for remembering the dead, the holiday for placing flowers on graves, and the graves in Centralia were not far away. The Oddfellows Cemetery sat at the southern edge of town, its wrought iron fence bordering the lane where children walked to school. With the holiday approaching, the Borough Council had turned its attention, as it did every year, to a practical and mundane problem. The town landfill needed cleaning. On May 7th, 1962, the Centralia Council met to discuss the approaching Memorial Day and how the town would go about cleaning up the Centralia landfill. The landfill in question was a relatively new one, situated in an abandoned strip mine pit just outside the borough limits, adjacent to the Oddfellows Cemetery. The strip pit had been left open after being excavated around 1935. It was approximately 75 feet wide and 50 feet deep. 75 feet wide, 50 feet deep. An open wound in the earth, repurposed by the borough as a place to put what no one wanted. The solution the council arrived at was the solution they had arrived at before, in previous years, without incident. Burn it. Set the refuse alight, let it reduce to ash, and be done with it before the holiday visitors arrived. The council set a date and hired 5 members of the volunteer firefighter company to clean up the landfill. 5 men. 5 ordinary men from an ordinary town, doing what their council had paid them to do on a Sunday morning in late May. The firemen piled the trash in one corner of the pit, set it afire, and later washed down the smouldering ashes with fire hoses. They believed when they left that evening that the job was done. They were not the last people in history to believe that fire, once doused, is finished. 2 days later, May 29th, flames were seen again at the dump site. Another attempt was made to thoroughly douse the fire with water and put it out for good. The flames retreated. Then on June 4th, the Centralia Fire Company once again brought out their hoses. A bulldozer stirred up the garbage so that firemen could douse concealed layers of burning waste. It was during this 3rd visit, with the bulldozer turning over the refuse, that someone noticed something that should have been noticed far sooner, that should have been found and sealed before any fire was ever lit. A hole as wide as 15 feet and several feet high was found in the base of the north wall of the pit. Garbage had concealed the hole and prevented it from being filled with non-combustible material. It is possible that this hole led to the mine fire, as it provided a pathway to the labyrinth of old mines under the borough, a 15-foot hole, hidden under garbage, connected directly to a labyrinth of abandoned mine tunnels that ran beneath the entire town, beneath the churches, beneath the post office, beneath the barber shop on Locust Avenue, beneath the kitchen floors and the bedroom walls of over 1,000 people who were going about their lives in the last ordinary days of their community's existence. By law, the borough was responsible for lining that pit. The borough was required to install a fire-resistant clay barrier between each layer of the landfill, but had fallen behind schedule, leaving the barrier incomplete. This is what a government investigation would later confirm. Not an act of God, not a geological inevitability, a clay barrier unfinished, a hole in a wall unnoticed, a Sunday morning decision, perfectly ordinary, perfectly routine, that found its way into the earth's memory and has never come back out. Consider for a moment what was in that landfill. the accumulated refuse of a small American town in the early 1960s. Old newspapers with headlines about Kennedy and the space program and the Dodgers. Tin cans, glass bottles with their paper labels still intact. Perhaps a child's broken toy, wrapped in newspaper. Perhaps the receipts from a hardware store, or a winter's worth of coal ash from a kitchen furnace. The ordinary archaeology of ordinary life, compressed into a 50-foot pit in the Pennsylvania earth. None of those objects were remarkable. Every one of them was a record of people who were alive. And somewhere at the bottom of that pile, in the dark corner of a landfill trench, where the clay barrier had never been completed, the fire found the hole, the fire found the coal, and the coal, the ancient, patient, energy-dense anthracite of the Buck Mountain seam, laid down over 300 million years ago in the Pennsylvanian geological epoch, received the fire the way tinder receives a match, without hesitation, without remainder. On August 9th, 1962, the mines near Centralia were permanently closed when carbon monoxide, a byproduct of the underground fire, was detected underground. It had been barely 10 weeks since the landfill was lit. 10 weeks. The summer of 1962 was still warm. The gardens on Locust Avenue were still in flower. Children were still playing in the streets of a town that did not yet know it was already over. The mine inspector who came to test the air rising from the cracks near the landfill was a man named Art Joyce. He ran his instruments over the wisps of smoke curling from the earth and read the numbers. He came to the realization that the smoke rising from the cracks in the ground was high in carbon monoxide, a gas that typically came from coal fires. Wahidi wrote his report. The council wrote a letter to the Lehigh Valley Coal Company, describing, with bureaucratic caution, a situation they did not yet fully comprehend. The letter referred to what was burning beneath their town as, in their own words, a fire of unknown origin. Unknown origin. As if the earth had simply decided, on its own, to begin burning. Now, hear this number, and let it land where it belongs. Centralia's population stood at 1,000 in 1980, nearly 2 full decades after the fire began. Still a community of 1,000 souls who had adapted, as human beings do, to a creeping catastrophe. They had learned to live with the smell, learned to sleep beneath carbon monoxide detectors. I learned to watch for cracks in the pavement, for dead patches in the grass, for the places where the snow melted first in winter because the ground was warm. By 2020, that same borough had a population of 5. 1,000 people. Then 5. That is not a statistic. That is the sound of a place going silent, one family at a time, over the course of 60 years. It is the sound of a moving van in the driveway, and a door locking for the last time, and a key left on a kitchen counter no one will ever clean again. Locust Avenue, once lined with buildings, today presents only a grid of empty streets, driveways disappearing into vacant lots, concrete steps leading to nothing, buckled sidewalks that no longer connect anything to anything. The steps are still there because the earth remembers the steps. The sidewalks are still there because concrete endures longer than the reasons for pouring it. But the houses, the 1,000-plus structures that once held the weight of ordinary American lives, are gone, demolished, taken by eminent domain, and erased from the surface of the earth so methodically that a visitor today, standing in the middle of what was once Centralia's main street, might look in every direction and see only grass and tree line and the occasional ghost of a foundation swallowed slowly by Pennsylvania soil. But that is today. On the morning of May 27th, 1962, 5 volunteer firefighters drove a truck to the edge of a landfill next to a cemetery and did what they had been paid to do. They lit a fire. They thought they put it out. They drove home in the late afternoon light of a Pennsylvania Sunday, past the churches letting out their evening services, past the children on their bicycles, past the barber shop with its closed sign in the window, past all the ordinary, unremarkable, irreplaceable life of a town that did not know it was standing on its own grave. The fire, meanwhile, did not go home. It went down, and it has not stopped moving since. What does it mean to lose a town not to disaster, but to a decision? Not to a flood or an earthquake or an act of war, but to a Sunday morning, a clay barrier left unfinished, and a hole in a wall that no one thought to look for. The people of Centralia did not lose their home in a moment. They lost it in 10,000 ordinary moments, each one slightly worse than the last, until one day ordinary life became impossible, and the word condemned was stamped across every deed in the borough. Who decides when a place is over? And who remembers that it was ever alive? There is a particular kind of silence that has no name in the English language. It is not the silence of peace, not the silence of sleep. It is the silence of something waiting, the silence of a thing that has already won and knows it and feels no need to announce itself. That is the silence beneath Centralia, Pennsylvania. And beneath that silence, 300 feet down, burrowed into the black heart of the Appalachian earth, something burns. Tonight, right now, as you listen to these words. A fire that does not flicker. A fire that does not roar. A fire that simply endures, the way only truly old, truly patient things can endure. To understand what happened to Centralia, to truly feel the weight of it settle into your chest, you must first understand what the town was built upon. Not metaphorically, literally. You must go underground. The Buck Mountain Coal Bed. That is its proper geological name. A seam of anthracite coal that was excavated, carved into, and tunneled through for over a century, beginning in the 1850s, until the mines were eventually abandoned, leaving behind a labyrinth of empty shafts and passages running in every direction beneath the streets, beneath the churches, beneath the kitchen floors and the backyard gardens of over 1,000 ordinary American lives. Anthracite. The word itself sounds ancient, almost ceremonial, and in geological terms, it is. Anthracite coal doesn't need much encouragement to catch fire. Under the right circumstances, it can ignite itself through spontaneous combustion. The decomposition of pyrite present in the coal produces heat, and in some cases, that self-heating alone is enough to start a fire. These are not the words of a storyteller trying to unsettle you. These are the words of research geologist Alan Kolker, speaking to the science of it. The coal beneath Centralia was always restless. It was always, in some sense, ready. When the dump fire of May 1962 ignited the Buck Mountain anthracite seam, it found a willing partner in the local geology. The moderately dipping beds, tilted at 22 degrees on the north limb of the Locust Mountain anticline, permitted the fire to quickly reach depth. Fractured and moderately dipping strata at the site allowed air to circulate into the subsurface, promoting combustion and making it profoundly difficult to extinguish what had begun. Think about what that means. The very shape of the earth beneath Centralia, the angle of the rock, the cracks already present from a century of mining, acted as a natural bellows, a system of ventilation, a mechanism for feeding the fire exactly what it needed, exactly when it needed it, without any human assistance whatsoever. The earth was breathing the fire alive. Picture yourself standing here, in the center of Centralia, in the autumn of 1962, some 5 months after the landfill was lit. Stand on what was then Locust Avenue, where elm trees still lined the street and Mrs. Hynoski's curtains were still white in the upstairs window. Press the heel of your boot against the pavement. Feel nothing unusual. Go home. Make supper. Put the children to bed. Meanwhile, 300 feet below your feet, in a darkness so complete that no human eye had seen it for decades, flames descended through the mine tunnels, sometimes nearing temperatures of 1,350 degrees Fahrenheit. Moving through the old shafts and passages the way water moves through river channels, finding the path of least resistance, turning corners, doubling back, spreading outward along coal seams that had not seen air or light since the Eisenhower administration. It was not destroying the tunnels. It was occupying them, settling in, making itself at home in the exact spaces that human industry had carved out and then abandoned. The fire moved into empty rooms and did not leave. As the fire advanced during the 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s, it did so along 4 fronts simultaneously. 4 separate directions. 4 separate tentacles of heat threading through the geology beneath a town that, for years, had almost no idea of the scale of what was happening below them. Residents noticed odd smells, occasional wisps of smoke, odd smells of sulfur. As months passed, smoke began rising from the ground more frequently, plants began to die, and the air became thick with the smell of sulfur. But mine fires, as author Joan Quigley observed in her meticulously researched 2007 account, were simply a part of life in coal country. You smelled sulfur. You opened the window. You went about your day. On August 9th, 1962, just 10 weeks after the landfill burned, the mines near Centralia were permanently closed when carbon monoxide, a byproduct of the fire, was detected underground. Carbon monoxide, the gas with no smell, no color, no warning. The gas that simply, quietly, stops the body from carrying oxygen through the blood. The mines were closed to protect the workers, and the town above those mines went on living, as if the closing of a mine shaft were an administrative matter, a labor issue, something that had nothing to do with the linoleum floor of a kitchen, or the plaster walls of a child's bedroom, or the foundations of a church that had stood since 1865. Now, stand still. Put your hand flat against that kitchen floor. Imagine the floor is warm. In his 1986 book, Unseen Danger, local journalist David Deacock documented what life closest to the fire site had become. Burning eyes, the taste of sulfur, an acrid odor accompanied by headaches, lassitude, and respiratory troubles. These were not dramatic symptoms. They were quiet ones, the kind a person might attribute to getting older, to the Pennsylvania winter, to stress, to anything except the truth. that the ground itself had become a source of slow, invisible poison. By the late 1970s, carbon monoxide monitors had become standard equipment in the homes closest to the fire. Think about what that means for a moment. Families in Centralia went to sleep at night in houses equipped with the same equipment used in industrial work sites. Sensors designed to detect the presence of a gas that kills sleeping people without waking them. In some homes, carbon monoxide levels in certain rooms reached almost 3 times the safety threshold. And still, families stayed. They stayed because it was home. They stayed because home, for most people, is not a rational calculation. It is something older and harder to name. Then came Valentine's Day, 1981. February 14th, 1981 was a Saturday. A group of Pennsylvania state politicians happened to be touring the town that morning, meeting with borough officials about the ongoing fire situation. Word traveled fast in a small town. Florence Domboski, curious about the official-looking strangers on her street, sent her 12-year-old son, Todd, on a small errand. Go find out who they are, what they want. Todd Domboski walked out into the cold, February air and headed toward the commotion. He never completed the errand. Before he began sinking into the ground, Todd noticed something. A wisp of smoke floating upward from the earth, like a smoldering match buried under damp leaves. In Centralia, such wisps were not entirely unfamiliar. But something about this one caught his eye. He walked toward it. He leaned forward to look, and then the ground simply opened. Todd saved himself from plunging fully into the toxic inferno below by clinging to a tree root, hanging in the dark with the heat rising around him, until his cousin followed the sound of his screaming and pulled him back to the surface. Later, when engineers measured the void that had swallowed him, the hole was found to be close to 300 feet deep, with a temperature of 350 degrees and 11 parts per million of carbon monoxide. 11 parts per million. The United States Occupational Safety and Health Administration sets the maximum safe exposure limit for an 8-hour workday at 50 parts per million. Todd Domboski, hanging in the dark by a root, was breathing air that would have killed him in minutes if he had remained. He had been sent on a small errand by his mother. He was 12 years old. He is gone now, too. Todd Domboski passed away in Altoona in February of 2022 at the age of 53, having lived his whole life carrying the particular weight of being the boy the earth tried to swallow. We say his name here because names matter. Because in a story this large and this impersonal, a story of geology and government and economics and fire, it is very easy to lose the human beings inside it. His name was Todd. The sinkhole on Locust Avenue was not an anomaly. It was a preview. Geological study of the site confirmed that the old mine maps showed a shaft had once existed at that location. While it had been filled in during the mine's closure, the fire gases heated and loosened the fill material, causing it to give way. Everywhere beneath Centralia, in every abandoned shaft and tunnel and gallery that the miners had carved out across a century of extraction, the same process was underway. The heat was liquefying the earth from within. The filled-in spaces were becoming hollow again. The ground that 1,100 people walked on every day was, in geological reality, a ceiling, and the ceiling was thinning. The fire had found all the rooms. It was warming them. It was making space. Here is a number that deserves to sit with you for a moment in the quiet before you sleep. Geologists studying the Centralia site, including those cited by Pennsylvania's own Department of Environmental Protection, estimate that the anthracite coal seam beneath the borough contains enough fuel to sustain the fire for an estimated 250 additional years under current conditions. 250 years. The fire that began in a trash pit next to the Odd Fellows Cemetery in the spring of 1962 started possibly by 5 volunteer firefighters on a Sunday morning, doing what the Borough Council had asked them to do. Will still be burning, according to the science, in the year 2276. Your great-great-great-grandchildren will grow old and die before this fire goes out. The cemetery front of the fire alone has been advancing at approximately 20 meters per year, a rate consistent since 1962, as confirmed by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. 20 meters per year. Quiet. Steady. Unhurried. The pace of a thing that knows it has nothing but time. If you were to press your palm flat against the pavement on the old stretch of Route 61 tonight, the condemned stretch, the one no car has driven legally since 1993, you would feel warmth rising through the asphalt. Not warmth like sunlight stored in stone, a different kind. A warmth from below, a warmth that has no season, that does not change in January, that does not know the difference between midnight and noon. The underground fire burns as deep as 300 feet below the surface, fueled by vast deposits of anthracite coal, and supplied with oxygen through the interconnected tunnels left by over a century of mining. The ground in Centralia has a temperature. It is alive in the way that only fire is alive, consuming, patient, indifferent to the lives that once moved across its surface. In the town above, a kitchen linoleum floor carries a 4-inch crack running from the base of the refrigerator to the far wall. A crack that was not there in 1979. A crack that has grown incrementally with each passing winter as the earth beneath the foundation shifts and settles and opens. On the counter above that crack, a teacup sits where it was left. It has been years since anyone placed it there. The tea inside, long since evaporated, left a ring at the bottom, a brown circle, the color of old pennies, that no one will ever wash away. The crack in the floor continues to grow. The fire below continues to move. And somewhere in the dark, 300 feet down, the Buck Mountain coal bed burns on, as it has burned every single night since 1962, through every administration, every decade, every season, waiting with all the patience of the geological world for a surface that will one day no longer hold. Where does a fire go when there is no one left to see it? It goes deeper. It goes further. It goes on. There is a particular kind of courage that the world tends not to celebrate. It does not arrive on a battlefield. It does not announce itself with ceremony. It shows up, instead, on a Tuesday morning when an official government letter arrives in the post box of a house you have lived in for 40 years. A house where your children took their first steps, where your parents died, where the wallpaper in the back bedroom still carries a water stain shaped like a question mark from a leak that was fixed in 1971. And the letter informs you, in the formal language of bureaucracy, that you no longer own this place, that you never will again, that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has invoked eminent domain over every deed in the borough of Centralia, and that your home, now belongs to the state. Most people receiving such a letter would eventually leave. Some did not. To understand the holdouts of Centralia, the men and women who looked at a condemned, burning earth and said no, you must first understand what the 1980s felt like inside those houses. Not from a distance, from inside. By the early 1980s, residents were passing out in their homes from carbon monoxide poisoning. The trees had begun to die. The ground had turned to ash in places. Babies were sleeping in homes equipped with carbon monoxide monitors. In some rooms, the readings reached almost 3 times the safety threshold. 3 times. The monitors would sound their alarm in the dark, that flat, insistent electronic tone, and a family would wake and open windows in the middle of a Pennsylvania winter and stand in the cold night air of a street that was slowly being emptied of everyone they had ever known. And then, when the alarm stopped, some of them would go back to bed. Because it was home. Because home, for certain people rooted in a place the way anthracite roots in rock, is not a building you live in. It is the accumulated weight of everything that has ever happened to you. It is the graves of your grandparents on the hill above the cemetery, and the crack in the kitchen floor that your father always meant to fix, and the view from the back window that you have watched change through every season of your entire life. You do not leave that because a government letter tells you to. You do not leave it because the earth beneath it is warm. You stay, and you find ways to justify the staying that no one outside that specific attachment to that specific place could ever fully understand. Those who remained in Centralia liked to keep up appearances. This detail, quiet, almost tender, is the one that stays with you longest when you sit with the full history of this place. Not the geology, not the government failures, not the legal battles. The fact that people living in the last inhabited houses of a condemned and burning town kept up appearances. In mid-January, Christmas decorations still adorned the street lamps. A large manger scene occupied a corner of the main intersection. A 2010 calendar hung in the empty borough building. A calendar? In a building that no longer functioned as a borough building in any meaningful sense. A building in a municipality that had no post office, no school, no functioning commerce, no newspaper. Someone had hung a calendar. Because that is what you do in January. You hang a new calendar. You mark the weeks. You imply by this act that time will continue to pass in an orderly fashion, that the future has appointments to keep, that the place you inhabit is still a place in the full sense of the word. The calendar was the bravest thing in Centralia. Picture yourself walking Locust Avenue on a winter morning in 1985. You have lived on this street your entire life. Your boots know every crack in the pavement, every heave where a tree root once pushed through. But the street is different now. Where there were once 40 houses, there are perhaps 15. Where there were once neighbors whose names you knew since childhood. The Kowalski family on the corner, the Andrades 2 doors down, the Buckley children who used to ride their bicycles into your yard. There are now lots, rectangular depressions in the earth, where foundations were already beginning to fill with grass and wild growth, as if the land were trying to forget the outlines of the rooms that had stood there. The town had become a moonscape of empty lots, punctuated by the occasional house belonging to holdouts who refused to leave. You walk past the empty lot where the Andrade house used to be. You remember standing in their kitchen in 1968, drinking coffee, talking about the mine fire that had just been in the newspaper again. You remember thinking, it will be solved. Governments solve things. Engineers solve things. This is America. Problems get fixed. The lot is now just weeds and a concrete front step, leading to nothing. If you were to walk through that door today, the door that is no longer there, hanging in the air above a step that goes nowhere, what would you find? Grass, broken concrete, the ghost of a threshold that once meant welcome home. By 1980, numerous residents were having serious issues with deadly mine fire gases creeping into their homes. One of the most documented early cases was John Coddington, who ran a gas station on the main road through town. In 1979, his gas station was closed because the mine fire had been heating the underground gasoline tank. Think about what that means. The fire beneath Centralia had grown hot enough to warm the fuel tanks buried under a gas station. The Pennsylvania Department of Health eventually declared his home uninhabitable. He was among the first to be relocated. He was not the last. The homes of the Burge, Andrade, and Buckley families were declared uninhabitable. By March 1981, the Office of Surface Mining had devised a plan to relocate them. One by one, families received their notices. One by one, moving vans appeared on streets that had once been full of them. One by one, houses were vacated, assessed, purchased by the Commonwealth, and demolished, usually within weeks of the last occupant leaving, as if the state feared that any delay might allow second thoughts. The local newspaper published a weekly list of who was leaving. A weekly list. Of neighbors. Published in a newspaper read by neighbors, so that everyone in the remaining community could track week by week who had decided that the fire had finally won, who had finally accepted the government's offer and signed the paper and handed over the key. There are forms of social pressure more powerful than any government notice. The weekly list was one of them, because each name on it was an implicit question directed at every name not yet on it. When will you follow? Some never did. In 1983, the U.S. Congress allocated more than $42 million, equivalent to $130 million in 2025, for relocation efforts. Nearly all of the residents accepted the government's buyout offers. More than 1,000 people moved out of the town, and 500 structures were demolished. By 1990, the census recorded 63 remaining residents. 63 people? In a town built for over 1,000, living in houses surrounded on all sides by empty lots and the skeletal remains of a community. Fire hydrants still standing at the curbs of demolished houses, hydrants connected to water pipes that served no remaining structure, hydrants waiting for fires that no one would call them to fight, street signs marking intersections where one road still had a house on it, and the other had been empty for 3 years. And those 63 people were, in the eyes of Pennsylvania law, now squatters. In 1992, Governor Robert Casey decided to shut the town, saying the fire had become too dangerous. The holdouts fought the condemnation, blocking appraisers from entering their homes. They stood in their own doorways of houses they had owned for decades, houses they had painted and repaired and heated and cooled through 30 years of Pennsylvania seasons, and they refused to let the government's assessors inside. They were, at this point, living rent-free and tax-free in houses that legally belonged to the Commonwealth. They were also, by any measure, among the most stubborn human beings in the recorded history of Pennsylvania. Among them was a man named John Lokitis Jr. Lokitis became the unofficial caretaker of the town after the state of Pennsylvania stopped maintaining it. He cut the grass along the west 200-block area of Locust Street. He unlocked and relocked the cemetery gates at St. Ignatius Cemetery every single morning and every single night. He repainted the American Legion bench on Locust Street as needed, at his own expense. He even refurbished several of the town's Christmas decorations and mounted them on the utility poles near his house each December. Read that again and let it settle. Entice man whose town had been condemned by the government, whose neighbors had almost all departed, whose streets were bordered by empty lots and warning signs about toxic gases and unstable ground. This man maintained the Christmas decorations. On utility poles on a street where there were no longer enough people to look at them. He repainted a bench outside a Legion hall that had no active membership. He opened and closed the cemetery gates every single day, as if the dead buried there still needed someone to do that for them, as if the act of maintenance were itself a form of loyalty, as if to say, as long as someone cares for this place, it is not yet gone. John Lokitis Jr. was a fourth-generation Centralian. When he was finally ordered to vacate, and then watched his late grandfather's 2-story row home on West Park Street be demolished, he tacked a sign on the front porch before the wrecking crew arrived. It read, "Requiescat in pace, rest in peace. Sorry, Pop." He could not bear to watch it come down, but he could not stay away either, and returned after the wrecking crew had finished. "It was part of my life for all 39 years, that house," he said. "It was difficult to leave it, and difficult to see it demolished. Sorry, Pop. 2 words, on a sign, on a porch, on a house that was about to become a lot. 2 words carrying the full weight of inheritance, of being the generation in a family's history that watches the place end, of being the one who cannot pass it on, because there is nothing left to pass." And then there was Carl Wommer, the last official mayor of Centralia. Carl Wommer had served in World War II with the U.S. Army's 71st Division, participating in the Central Europe and Rhineland campaigns. He was discharged with the rank of Staff Sergeant. He had worked as a machinist with Rockwell Industries in Reading for more than 25 years. He had lived in Centralia most of his life, and his wife Helen, who died in 2001, had been what one account described as an implacable foe of relocation. Helen Wommer had been one of the most vocal opponents of the government's buyout program for years. She had fought the state with the particular ferocity of a woman who had made her home in a particular place and intended to die in it. She did die in it. In 2001, in a town that was already mostly gone. When reporters asked Karl Wommer, then 86 years old, whether he thought he would have to leave, he said simply, "Nothing's happened. We're still here. No one's told us to move." Nothing's happened, said by a man living in a condemned borough, in a house seized through eminent domain, surrounded on 3 sides by empty lots, in a town whose zip code no longer existed, whose post office had been demolished, whose last school had closed, whose church had been razed, whose streets connected nothing to nothing, and who maintained, with the particular equanimity of a man who had survived a world war, that nothing had happened. Karl Wommer died in Centralia in May of 2014. He was 90 years old. He was buried with military honors beside Helen in St. Ignatius Cemetery, on the other side of Locust Street from his old home, the cemetery where the fire had begun in 1962, with a landfill set alight beside a graveyard in preparation for Memorial Day. He went home in the end, just not the home he had wanted. In 2009, Governor Ed Rendell began the formal eviction of Centralia's remaining residents. By early 2010, only 5 occupied homes remained. In lawsuits, the remaining residents alleged that they were victims of massive fraud, motivated primarily by interests in what is conservatively estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars of some of the best anthracite coal in the world. There it is. The other layer of this story, the one that the remaining residents had been saying for decades, in the language of people who have watched institutions fail them so completely that conspiracy becomes indistinguishable from policy. The coal beneath Centralia, the same coal that had sustained the community for 100 years, had now become, in the view of those who refused to leave, the reason the community was being extinguished. Not the fire, the coal, the hundreds of millions of dollars of anthracite that no one could touch, while people were still living above it. In October 2013, state and local officials reached a settlement with the 7 remaining residents, allowing them to remain in Centralia until their deaths, after which the rights to their properties would be taken through eminent domain. Permission to die in your home? That is what the settlement amounted to. Not ownership. Not the right to pass anything to your children. Just the right to live out whatever years remained in the house that was no longer yours, on ground that would revert to the state the morning after your last breath. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, having waited out the legal battles for 2 decades, had discovered that the most efficient solution was simply to wait. The fire was patient. It turned out the government could be patient too. Now hear this number where it belongs, in the dark and the quiet before sleep. More than 1,000 people moved out of Centralia. 500 structures were demolished. 500 buildings, houses, shops, churches, schools, the post office, the bar, reduced to rubble, the rubble hauled away, the lots graded flat, the grass eventually growing back over foundations like green bandages, applied to wounds the earth did not ask for. 500 structures. Each one a set of rooms where people had lived, where meals had been made and arguments had been had, and children had been put to bed with stories, and the radio had played, and someone had always eventually turned off the last light. Today, Locust Avenue, once lined with buildings, presents only a grid of empty streets, driveways disappearing into vacant lots, concrete steps leading nowhere, buckled, sidewalks connecting nothing to nothing. The steps are still there, the sidewalks are still there, the fire hydrants stand at their corners, patient and purposeless, waiting for an emergency no one will call them to respond to. And somewhere in the handful of remaining houses, as of this very night, a small number of people, fewer than you could count on one hand, wake each morning in the most quietly extraordinary act of resistance in American domestic history. They make their coffee. They look out their windows at streets lined with the absence of everything that used to be there. They do whatever a person does on a Tuesday morning in a condemned town above a fire that will not go out. They live. Where are the others now? The 1,000 people who left, who packed their photographs and their good dishes and their children's drawings into cardboard boxes and drove away from Locust Avenue for the last time, down a road that the fire would one day crack and close forever. They are in Mount Carmel and Ashland and towns all over Columbia County, growing old in houses that are not the houses they grew up in. Some of them have died in those houses. Some of them go back on a Sunday afternoon and stand at the edge of the lot where their home used to be. Does the earth remember them? Does any earth remember anyone? And does anyone, anywhere, still say their names? Every condemned place has a threshold, a single point where the ordinary world ends and the other thing begins. A doorway, a fence line, a change in the quality of the air that you feel before you consciously register it. In Centralia, Pennsylvania, that threshold is a stretch of asphalt 3/4 of a mile long, running south from the edge of what remains of the town, through a corridor of trees and hillside, toward a vanishing point that no longer leads anywhere. It was once called Pennsylvania Route 61. Most people know it now by another name, earned not through any official designation, but through the slow accumulation of human response to a place that should not exist, should not, by the logic of roads and commerce and the ordinary movement of daily life, be there at all. They called it the Graffiti Highway. It wasn't always known by that name. That name was coined as recently as 2010. Previously, the road was simply what it truly was, an old, abandoned section of Route 61 that had to be closed in the early 1990s because the mine fire beneath Centralia posed a real threat to its structural integrity. Subsidence was leading to uneven surfaces. Steam poured out through cracks in the asphalt. Steam through cracks in a public road. On a highway that carried ordinary traffic, trucks and station wagons and school buses and delivery vans, until the morning the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation looked at what was happening to the pavement and made the only decision that remained: close it, reroute around it, and leave it to whatever came next. What came next was 30 years of silence. And then, slowly, something else. Picture yourself here. Not in daylight. Not on a sunny afternoon with other visitors nearby. Not with the reassurance of company and noise. Picture yourself here at dusk, in November, when the Pennsylvania sky turns the particular gunmetal gray that seems to have no source, as if the light were simply being withdrawn from the world rather than replaced by darkness. You are standing at the northern end of the abandoned stretch. A barrier of earth and fill material blocks the road where it meets the edge of the still inhabited borough. There is a gap in the barrier, just wide enough for a person to pass through on foot. You pass through. The road unfolds ahead of you, a pale ribbon of cracked asphalt descending gently into the tree line. And immediately, before you have walked 20 feet, you understand that something is different here. The pavement beneath your boots is not cold the way pavement is cold in November. It is not warm the way pavement warmed by afternoon sun is warm, that fading, borrowed warmth that disappears by evening. This warmth comes from below. It is constant. It does not vary with the air temperature or the time of day or the season. On cold days or after a heavy rain, steam will waft up from the fissures in the road, making for an especially eerie sight. Tonight it does exactly that. Thin white tendrils curling upward from the cracks, catching what remains of the light, dissolving into the grey air above the tree line. The road smells of sulphur. Not overwhelmingly. Not the way industrial sites smell. Not assaultively. It is a background note, a mineral undertone beneath the smell of autumn leaves and cold earth. The smell of something geological, something ancient and indifferent, doing what it does regardless of whether anyone is here to smell it. You walk. The surface of the road bulges and ripples in places, buckled by the subsidence of mine shafts and timbers that caught fire far beneath the land. The center lane has pulled apart from the edge in a long diagonal split, a crack running 40 feet or more across both lanes, wide enough in places to lose a boot in. Down inside it, when you crouch and look, there is darkness, and from that darkness, warmth rises. The kind of warmth that makes the hair on the back of your hand lift slightly, the way it does near a radiator. The kind of warmth that has no business being in the earth. A speed limit sign still stands at the roadside. 25 miles per hour. White letters on a regulation green background, identical to every other speed limit sign on every other road in Pennsylvania. Slightly faded now, slightly tilted, but legible, authoritative, directing traffic on a road that has carried no legal traffic since 1993, telling no one, in the language of the state, how fast to go. It is the most surreal object in Centralia, more surreal than the steam, more surreal than the cracked asphalt. The sign, with its 25 miles per hour, still believes in this road, still insists that it is a road, still speaks in the patient voice of institutional signage to drivers who will never come. For nearly 2 decades after it closed, the road sat in relative obscurity. Then, around 2010, people began to come. Photos from 20 years prior show just a few, tentative tags. But the space soon, in the words of filmmaker Joe Sapienza, took on a life of its own. By 2013, when Sapienza's crew embarked on their early morning scout of the area for their documentary, Route 61 was a rainbow of colors in graffiti, that asphalt canvas occasionally interrupted by massive cracks and splits in the road that had sunk in years prior due to fallen mine shafts and timbers that caught fire beneath the land. What followed was extraordinary, in the way that human responses to devastation are often extraordinary. The abandoned stretch drew an estimated 50,000 to 65,000 visitors per year, according to local tourism estimates reported by Columbia County officials. 50,000 people, coming to stand on a condemned road above a fire that has been burning since before most of them were born, coming to add their mark to a surface that had already been marked by thousands before them, coming in some inarticulate way to witness, to say, I was here. This place existed. Someone should know. The messages they left ran the full range of human expression. Some were vulgar, the reflexive vandalism of anonymity and altitude and spray paint in the dark. Some were political. Some were declarations of love or loss, or the desperate present-tense urgency that graffiti always carries. A name, a date, proof of presence. The paintings ranged from the obscene and profane to the thought-provoking and even beautiful. And layered beneath them all, accumulating over 30 years like geological strata, were the messages that said nothing grand. The ones that simply noted, with a quiet that the louder tags could not drown out, someone stood here. Someone came to this particular place, in this particular ruined landscape, and wanted to leave a record that they had been present in it. One message, photographed over many years and reproduced in numerous accounts of the graffiti highway, read only this: I was here. Was anyone else? There are no birds in the section of Route 61 closest to the visible fire activity. This is not metaphor. It is observation, recorded by multiple visitors across decades. The absence of bird song, that particular quietness that feels like a subtraction rather than a natural silence, is one of the first things people notice when they walk the condemned stretch far enough south that the steam vents become frequent. As the months and years passed after the fire began underground, plants began to die, the trees began to thin, and the air became thick with the smell of sulfur. The ecosystem receded from the fire the way water recedes from a heat source. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, incrementally, until the area of visible biological withdrawal formed its own map of the fire's progress underground. The road knew before the government did. The trees knew before the engineers did. The birds knew before anyone. In April 2020, the property's current owners made the decision to cover over the graffiti on the highway section of old Route 61. Several hundred mounds of dirt were laid over the area, thus ending a decades-long fascination with the desolate stretch of road. The paintings are gone now, buried under fill, the way Centralia's houses are buried under grass, the way the town's entire history is buried under the long, indifferent patience of an earth that keeps its own records and does not consult the ones we keep. The road is gone. What remains on either side of the dirt mounds is the hillside, the rippling, cracked, steam-venting hillside, where smoke and steam can still be seen rising from fissures in the ground scattered about the area. Low, round metal steam vents protrude from the earth in the south of the borough, and several signs warn of underground fire, unstable ground, and dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. The signs are polite about it. They have the measured, institutional language of government safety notices. They describe, in calm font on yellow backgrounds, conditions that would be called catastrophic in any other context. Now walk uphill from the buried road, past the steam vents, past the warning signs, past the place where the tree line opens into a grassy slope. Here, on the hillside above the southern end of what was once Centralia's main street, sits St. Ignatius Cemetery. St. Ignatius is the largest of Centralia's cemeteries. It is also the one closest to the fire. Steam escapes from the ground no more than 100 feet or so on the other side of its fence. The gravestones are intact. The paths between the rows are maintained. Gravestones date to the mid-1800s, and the families buried here span the full ethnic history of a coal town built by immigrants. Irish names, Ukrainian names, Polish names, Italian names, the names of people who came from distant countries to dig coal out of this particular fold of the Pennsylvania mountains, and who ended their lives here and expected their descendants to tend their graves. Their descendants still come, on Sundays, with fresh flowers and push mowers, and the particular attention of people who understand that tending a grave is its own form of argument against forgetting. The town's 4 cemeteries, including the one on the hilltop, which has smoke rising around and out of it, are maintained in good condition. There is something in this fact that resists easy interpretation. The town is gone. The post office is gone. The schools, the churches, the bars, the hotels, the 2 theaters, the 14 grocery stores, all gone, demolished, or reclaimed by the earth. But the cemeteries are maintained. The dead of Centralia have not been abandoned, even by the people who had no choice but to abandon everything else. One of the current lines of fire runs just beneath St. Ignatius Cemetery. A former resident with family buried there once joked, with the gallows humor of someone who has no other kind left, that Centralia is the only place you can be buried and cremated at the same time. The headstones do not move. The names do not change. Below them, 300 feet down, the fire does what fire does. There is one more structure visible from the interstate, if you know where to look. One steeple, white against the tree line, rising from the far end of a street that no longer has houses on it. It belongs to the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, built in 1911, the only surviving church in a borough that once had 7. A geological survey found there was solid rock, not coal, under the church, so it is not in danger of collapse due to the fire. By geological accident, the one building that stands was spared. Not by planning, not by prayer, but by the specific composition of the ground beneath its foundations. It holds services on Sundays. It attracts worshippers from surrounding towns, including people who were once residents of Centralia. They come back, those former residents, on Sunday mornings, and they park on streets that used to have neighbors on them. And they walk into a church that outlasted everything it was built to serve. And they worship in the specific way of people who have lost almost everything except the place where they learned to believe in something. The steeple is visible from Route 61. If you are driving north and you know to look for it, past the steam vents on the hillside, past the warning signs, past the place in the road where the pavement begins to look wrong, you will see it. White. Still. Unchanged. A steeple attending a congregation that no longer lives within walking distance of it. A bell that still rings, on Sunday mornings, over a grid of streets that connect nothing to nothing. Imagine the sound of that bell at 2 a.m. on a January night. No one to hear it. The bell does not ring at 2 a.m., but imagine it. Imagine the sound traveling down Locust Avenue in both directions, finding no windows to rattle, no curtains to disturb, no sleeping children to half wake and roll over. The sound moving through a landscape of empty lots and fire hydrants and concrete steps that lead to grass, moving outward from the church, past the cemetery where the steam lifts off the ground in thin white columns, past the buried road, past the warning signs, out into the Pennsylvania hills. The hills receive the sound the way they receive everything, without comment, without record. By the 1990s, Centralia's population had dwindled from over 1,000 to fewer than 20 residents. The town lost its zip code in 2002, officially ceasing to exist in the eyes of the U.S. Postal Service. Most buildings were demolished to prevent them from becoming hazards, leaving behind a moonscape of empty lots punctuated by the occasional house, a church, or a cemetery, and buckled sidewalks connecting nothing to nothing. Nothing to nothing. That phrase, buckled sidewalks connecting nothing to nothing, is the most precise description of Centralia that has ever been written. It contains the whole of it, the engineering of a community, intact. The purpose of that engineering, gone. The sidewalks still run their routes. They still meet at corners. They still carry the faint impressions of the thousands of footsteps that shaped them over a century of use. But the doors they led to do not exist. The porches they approached have been demolished. The families whose boots wore the smooth paths into the concrete are scattered across Columbia County, growing old in other towns, walking on sidewalks that connect living things to other living things. Here, the sidewalks just connect to each other. They connect to each other and to the empty air where houses used to stand, and to the fire hydrants that stand at the corners of intersections waiting for emergencies that will never require them, and to the particular, heavy quiet of a place that was once full of children. Where did the children go? The children who walked these sidewalks to St. Ignatius Parochial School, the children who rode their bicycles down Locust Avenue, who played in the yards of houses that are now empty lots, who were put to bed at night in rooms that no longer exist. Where did they go? They grew up somewhere else. In Mount Carmel, in Ashland, in towns they did not choose, in houses that are not the houses they remember. Some of them are grandparents now. Some of them have tried to explain Centralia to children who have never seen it. How do you explain a place that no longer exists to someone who never knew it? How do you make them feel the weight of streets that connect nothing to nothing, of a speed limit sign still standing on a road no one drives, of steam rising from the earth where your grandmother's kitchen used to be? You cannot entirely. That knowledge dies with the people who carry it, and the fire moves on, and the road stays buried, and the steeple stands in the trees, white against the Pennsylvania sky, belonging to a town that the maps still name, but the earth has already begun to reclaim. Pull back now. Step away from the street grid and the steam vents and the cemetery gates and the speed limit sign on the road that no one drives. Step back far enough that Centralia becomes what it truly is when seen from the right distance. Not a ghost town, not a cautionary tale, not an environmental curiosity, but a process. Something still unfolding. Something that is happening right now, tonight, as you listen, as you breathe, as you settle into the particular stillness of the late hour. The fire beneath Centralia is not history. It is the present tense. Scientists who have studied the blaze estimate it could continue consuming underground anthracite coal for another 250 years, potentially burning until the year 2276. 2276. That is not a number that the human mind was built to hold. We understand our own lifetimes. We can, with effort, comprehend our grandchildren's lifetimes, and perhaps their children's. But 2276 is 11 generations from now. It is a year in which everything we currently call the present, every name we know, every building we can see from where we sit, every argument we are having about every subject that feels urgent, will be as distant as the American Revolution feels to us tonight. And in 2276, if the geologists are right, the Buck Mountain coal bed beneath what was once Centralia, Pennsylvania, will still be burning. The fire does not know about 2276. The fire does not know about years at all. It knows only carbon and oxygen and heat and the patient geometry of abandoned tunnels stretching through the Appalachian dark. The Centralia fire now reaches as deep as 300 feet and covers some 6 square miles, more than 7 Disneylands in area. It is advancing around 75 feet per year along 4 separate branches. 75 feet per year, quiet, methodical. The pace of something that has nowhere particular to be, and all the time in the geological world to get there. According to data maintained by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, the Centralia mine fire is one of approximately 38 to 45 underground mine fires currently burning across the state of Pennsylvania alone. Read that number again. 38 to 45. Centralia is the one that became famous, the one with the documentary within the documentary, the horror film it inspired, the graffiti highway that drew 50,000 visitors a year until it was buried under dirt in a pandemic spring. But beneath the hills of Pennsylvania, dozens of other fires burn in their own darkness, unnamed and largely unobserved, consuming coal that was left behind when the companies took what they could and moved on. Centralia is not the exception. It is simply the one that had a town above it at the wrong moment in the wrong year. Consider what the borough of Centralia still possesses in 2026 that most people do not know about. It still has a borough council. Technically, legally, the borough council still had regular meetings as of 2011. The town's highest bill at one reported meeting came from PPL Electric Utilities, $92. The town's budget was in the black, a condemned municipality, in a borough where the post office has been demolished and the Zippy code revoked and the streets connect nothing to nothing. This municipality balances its budget. It pays its electric bill of $92. It holds its meetings. There is something in this that resists interpretation. The machinery of governance continuing to operate in the absence of almost everything governance is designed to serve. A borough council meeting, in a borough of 5 people, on streets that are slowly being absorbed by the Pennsylvania hillside. Someone calls the meeting to order. Someone seconds the motion. Someone records the minutes. The minutes of Centralia's borough council meetings are, in their own quiet way, the strangest documents in American municipal history as of the 2020 census. 5 people reside in Centralia, Pennsylvania. 5. In a borough that was home to 2,761 people at its peak in 1890. In a community that had 7 churches and 5 hotels and 27 saloons and 2 theaters and a bank and a post office and 14 grocery stores. In a place that was, for nearly a century, as alive and purposeful and full of ordinary human noise as any small American town that ever existed. In that place, 5 people wake up each morning. These are people who watched their town get demolished around them, the church they were baptized in, the diner where they ate breakfast, the streets where their children learned to ride bicycles, and still chose to stay. They are, by any reasonable measure, among the most extraordinary ordinary people in the United States. Not because they are brave in any dramatic sense, not because they have done anything that would earn them a monument or a headline, but because they have chosen, every single day, to remain in a place that the government has declared should not be inhabited, that the earth itself is in the slow process of reclaiming, that the fire 300 feet below their feet will eventually, in its own geological time, cause to collapse entirely. They wake up on a Tuesday morning. They make their coffee. They look out their windows at streets lined with the absence of everyone who used to be there. They do what people do. They eat and sleep and go about whatever errands and routines remain available in a town with no shops, no school, no post office, no services of any municipal kind. They drive into neighboring Mount Carmel or Ashland for groceries. They come back. They turn onto Locust Avenue. They park in driveways of houses that belong legally to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They go inside. They are home. Picture yourself here tonight. Not tomorrow, not last year. Tonight, this specific night, while you listen to these words from wherever you are. Picture the borough of Centralia at this exact hour. The 5 remaining houses stand in the dark, their windows lit from within. The warm, yellow light of ordinary human habitation falling onto streets that were not built to be this empty. In the nearest occupied house, someone has turned the television on. The sound carries in the absence of traffic, in the absence of neighbors, in the silence that has replaced the noise of 1,000 people going about their evenings. Outside, the steam vents exhale into the cold air, thin white columns rising from the metal pipes that the government installed to release the pressure of gases that have nowhere else to go. The vents glow faintly in the dark, not with fire, but with the residual warmth of what burns far below. The ground itself is warm to the touch, as it has been every night since 1962, as it will be every night for another 250 years after the last resident is gone, and the last house is demolished, and the last name on the deed reverts to the state. The fire does not need anyone to watch it. It burns regardless. Here is the number that carries the full moral weight of this story. Not the 250 years of fuel remaining, not the 3,700 acres of underground terrain the fire has already consumed, not the $42 million spent relocating a community that the government then allowed to decline into something worse than poverty. In Pennsylvania, the average life expectancy is 78.6 years. In 28 of Pennsylvania's 67 counties, the average life expectancy is below the U.S. average significantly lower in counties with higher proportions of residents affected by environmental and economic hardship. Columbia County, where Centralia sits, is among those counties. The coal region of northeastern and central Pennsylvania, the region that built the industrial wealth of an entire nation, that heated American homes and powered American factories for a century, produces, in return, some of the shortest lives in the Commonwealth. The coal gave everything it had to the people who came to extract it. The people gave everything they had to the towns built above it. And when the coal was gone, or burning, or simply no longer economically convenient, what remained was left to manage its own ending in communities that had no other economic identity, no other history, no other reason to exist except the one that had already departed. Centralia is the clearest version of this story. But it is not the only version. Centralia was incorporated as a borough in 1866. Its principal employer was the anthracite coal industry. That sentence, its principal employer was the anthracite coal industry, is the most important sentence in the history of the place. It contains the whole of the town's founding logic and the whole of its eventual undoing. The town was built to serve the coal. When the coal began to burn in a way that could not be controlled, the town was condemned so that, eventually, the coal could be reached again. Several current and former Centralia residents alleged they were victims of massive fraud, motivated primarily by interests in what is conservatively estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars of some of the best anthracite coal in the world. Whether or not you accept that allegation, the arithmetic of it is not in dispute. The coal is still there. It is burning, yes, but anthracite coal seams are not uniform. They have depth and breadth and geological complexity. The fire occupies some of them. Others remain intact, inaccessible as long as anyone still lives above them. According to state law, when the municipality can no longer form a functioning municipal government, when there are no longer any residents, the borough legally ceases to exist. When the last resident dies, Centralia ceases to exist as a legal municipality. The Commonwealth acquires everything. The fire burns on. And the coal that does not burn, the coal that lies in the seams the fire has not yet reached, becomes available for consideration. The town that was built for coal will, in the end, be returned to it. There is a detail from Centralia's recent history that serves as the chapter's still life, the small human object that carries the chapter's full weight in a single image. In April 2021, a group of volunteers came to Centralia on cleanup day. They planted 250 apple trees around the borough to restore the town's ecosystem and wildlife habitats. 250 apple trees, on land that is condemned, on ground that is warm from below. In a borough of 5 people surrounded by empty lots and warning signs and the graves of a community that is mostly gone. Someone decided that apple trees should grow here. Someone brought the saplings and the shovels and the intention and planted 250 trees in the ground above a fire that will outlive every person who was present that day. In perhaps 30 years, those trees will bear fruit. In perhaps 50, they will be old trees, gnarled and productive, dropping apples onto ground that no one will pick them from, in a borough that may by then have no living residents at all. The apples will fall. The deer will come in the Pennsylvania dusk and eat what has fallen. The fire below will burn on, indifferent to the sweetness above it. Someone planted those trees anyway. That is the most human thing in this entire story. Tonight, while you sleep, the fire moves another inch. Not dramatically. Not with sound or light or any of the theatrics that fire usually performs when it wants to be noticed. Just an inch. Just the slow, cellular advance of combustion through coal that has been waiting in geological patience since the Pennsylvanian epoch. 300 million years before anyone thought to light a landfill beside the Odd Fellows Cemetery on a Sunday morning in May. The street that once held the church where people were baptized, the diner where they ate breakfast, the sidewalks where children learned to ride bicycles, all of it demolished and gone. And the handful who remain watched it happen around them and chose to stay. They are the last living memory of what Centralia was. When they are gone, and they will be gone, because everyone is, because that is the one thing that the fire and the people have in common, the one thing all things share. When they are gone, Centralia will exist only in records, in photographs, in the memories of people who grew up there and are now old in other towns. In this script, which you are hearing now, in the dark before sleep. The streets will remain for a while, the foundations under their cover of grass, the cemetery on the hill, maintained now, and for as long as the descendants of the buried come back to tend it. The steeple of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, visible from the highway to anyone who knows to look, white against whatever sky that particular morning provides. And the fire. Always the fire. As geologist Steve Jones once told Smithsonian Magazine, putting it out is the impossible dream. There is a priest in Centralia's history whose name deserves to be said aloud in the dark before we end. Father Daniel Ignatius McDermott, the first Roman Catholic priest to call Centralia home, was assaulted by members of the Molly Maguires in 1869. In his anger and grief, he declared that there would come a day when St. Ignatius Roman Catholic Church would be the only structure remaining in Centralia. St. Ignatius Church was demolished in 1997. Even the priest's curse could not outlast the fire. The church is gone. The priest is gone. The Molly Maguires who struck him are gone. Their leaders hanged in the county seat in 1878, buried in the hills they had fought over, their descendants scattered into the general American population, their names mostly forgotten. The founder of the town, Alexander Ray, was murdered on the road between Centralia and Mount Carmel in Eindam, 1868. The men who lit the landfill fire in 1962 are gone. The borough council members who authorized it are gone. The mine inspector who first tested the carbon monoxide rising from the cracks is gone. The 5 volunteer firefighters who drove the truck to the dump on that Sunday morning in May, who piled the trash and set it alight and believed when they drove home that the job was finished. They are gone. Everything that was human about this story is either gone or in the process of going. The fire is not. So here is the question this script was always moving toward. Not a question with an answer. A question to carry into sleep, into the particular quality of thinking that happens in the dark before consciousness dissolves. The families of Centralia, The 1,000 people who packed their station wagons and their photographs and their good dishes and drove away from Locust Avenue for the last time. Did they take the town with them? Is a town a place? Or is it the people who inhabit it? When the last resident of Centralia draws their last breath, and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania acquires the final deed, will Centralia cease to exist? Or will it continue, in the memory of the grandchildren who were told about it, in the maintenance of the cemetery, by people who come back every Sunday with flowers and push mowers, in the apple trees planted by volunteers in 2021? In this story you are hearing now? Does a place need people to be real? Or is it enough that the earth remembers? The Hynoski family lived on a particular block of Locust Avenue. The Wimmer family lived on Troutwine Street. The Lokitis family on West Park Street, in a house that a fourth-generation Centralian watched the wrecking crew reduce to rubble, unable to stay away from the sight of it. The Domboski family on the street where a 12-year-old boy fell into the fire and climbed back out by holding onto a root. Do you know their names now? You do. That is something. In the long arithmetic of forgetting, that is something. The fire moves another inch tonight. Sleep well.